Theodore Roosevelt declared, quote, "Order without liberty and liberty without order are equally destructive." The conversations in my family have recently often circled around the polarization of our nation and the outrage culture that seems to be the norm. So, I decided to research the causes and effects of outrage culture and how to counteract the negative influences of it. I began my research with former Navy SEAL and current Texas Representative Dan Crenshaw's book, Fortitude. With his clear-headed outlook from his days as a SEAL and his current immersion in our nation's political arena, he presented a solid foundation from which I could further my research with intellectual and reliable sources. I've read articles which cite studies by leading researchers on society and culture, and what I have discovered is quite disturbing. Outrage culture, which is spreading in our country at an alarming rate, is non-productive, and our society needs to return to reasonable, rational, and respectful public discourse. Let's begin by defining our terms. According to Dan Crenshaw, quote, "Outrage culture is the petty, weak-minded, and ultimately unproductive response to our neighbors, fellow citizens, and political opponents. It is the weaponization of emotion and the elevation of emotion above reason." And, according to Psychology Today, quote, "Outrage culture is the calamitization of the mundane." As stated in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, discourse is, quote, "a formal and orderly and usually extended expression of thought on a subject." Therefore, public discourse is the act of having an orderly and thorough conversation, verbally, in print, or even via social media, about any given situation or topic. Outrage culture harms both individuals and society as a whole. According to the Huffington Post, people with worthwhile insight fear being belittled, so they do not comment in controversial discussion. Former Governor of South Carolina and U.S. Ambassador to the UN states, quote, "Today's outrage culture insists that everyone who holds a view that's different from our own is not just mistaken, they must be evil and shunned." Fake news and misleading clickbait titles distract from relevant, important events by generating outrage. Psychologists report that people literally become fatigued from constant expressions of outrage on social media outlets, which are better suited for emotional outbursts rather than reasoned debate, and, by quote, "their social architecture rewards rage, extremism, and hostility." Crenshaw. Crenshaw also lists the casualties of outrage culture as ruined careers, destroyed relationships, increased depression, vicious and volatile politics, and a polarization of an American society. Quote, "When everything is worthy of outrage, effectively, nothing is." Ron Sinovitz. The root of outrage culture has several causes. Victimhood mentality is becoming more widespread, and the effect of seeing oneself as a victim leads to failure in taking responsibility. This failure of taking responsibility, according to Crenshaw, is toxic to society. Individuals who see themselves as victims tend to want to lash out at those they feel are responsible, which contributes to outrage culture.
The next person who has the sheer nerve, the sheer entitled caucasity to say all lives matter, I'm gonna stab you. I'm gonna stab you, and while you're struggling and bleeding out, I'm gonna show you my paper cut and say, my cut matters too.
This is Clara Janover, who recently posted this video on the social media platform TikTok, which then went viral. She later posted a response to this video.
Trump supporters took my job away from me. I've gotten death threats, rape threats, violent threats. It was okay. But now it's just like my future. My future is entirely compromised because Trump supporters have decided to come for my life. God.
Janover is a great example of victimhood mentality, as she believes that Trump supporters are the reason that she lost her job. But But losing her job may be due to the fact that most companies have a strict policy against threatening violence. Guy Aitchison, a researcher on social media behavior at the King's College in London, affirms that research suggests expression of outrage online can be habit forming. He also explains that social media emboldens individuals, which allows them to act in ways that they never would in face-to-face situations. According to NPR, psychologist Molly Crockett from Yale reveals that these cycles of outrage feed on each other. Crockett also admits that people have always experienced and expressed outrage over moral violations. Radio Liberty expresses that today's social media outlets increase the audience of this outrage exponentially, and the companies that own these social media platforms profit off of outrage because it attracts viewers, which disinclines them to control outrage. We can help decrease outrage culture's negative aspects by contributing to discussions or debates in reasonable, rational, and respectful manner. First, we must research and try to determine the facts of a given topic or situation. To do this, we cannot fall victim to clickbait, but we have to search through for authoritative sources and educate oneself on the subject. Blind observations or arguments will often lead to embarrassment of the speaker and increased emotional reaction from the person who is being addressed. Socratic dialogue, which I have learned to use during my last few years of school, puts forth that the first component of a reasonable discussion is to clearly define your terms, which I have done, which allows the individuals involved in the discussion to understand what the other is actually talking about. Throughout the discussion, one must endeavor to remain calm. Psychology Today notes that, quote, "We long for conflict, but we can be more vigilant about how we satisfy this desire." A good debate with both sides putting forth rational and reasonable arguments can be stimulating without the participants becoming outraged. Giuliani from UC Berkeley points to the old adage of putting oneself in the opponent's shoes. He relates that research confirms this message from a study in which helped Palestinians and Israelis have better attitudes towards each other. If it can work for these two ethnic groups, which have been at odds since basically the beginning of time, surely it can work in America. I, for one, have recently been fatigued from all the constant clickbaiting and demoralizing rants on social media and even in the news. The most alarming factor is the thought of a divided America or even a revolution. Jean-Pierre Reed, a researcher from the University of Memphis, studied the revolution in Nicaragua and determined that emotions, namely outrage, was exploited by clever insurrectionaries to channel the energy of the populace towards a revolution. America, as it stands, as former U.S. Secretary of Education William Bennett titled several of his books, is the last best hope. With our freedoms come responsibility to maintain order and to respect others. Theodore Roosevelt once stated that we should speak courteously, deal fairly, and keep armed and ready. While he most likely meant armed in a literal, physical sense, I propose a metaphorical sense of knowledge and rhetorical might. So how can we engage in civilized public discourse and turn the tide of outrage culture? Well, we must research and know our facts, define the terms, and ask others in the discussion to do so as well. Remain composed, but do not be afraid to be spirited. And finally, we must keep an open mind enough to consider the other individual's perspectives.